Good afternoon, LinkedIn Live. How are we doing? Happy Friday. Hello, Sharniya. How are you doing?
Happy Friday. I'm good. As ever, excited that
Yeah.
we've come to the end of another interesting week and that it's Friday.
Oh, haven't we? And you know what? I think a lot of people are really pleased just to get to the end of January. It seems like January's been quite brutal, busy and brutal.
It's been busy. It's definitely been brutal, personally and professionally. There's been a lot of ups and downs. And I did say to my friend the other day, I'm writing it off as a bit of a demon month. So for me, 2024 started 9 days ago.
I'm taking that. I'm having that one. 2024 has just started. If you're joining us, thanks for joining us live, or if you're watching the replay, please say hello in the comments. Comments have been a little bit glitchy lately on these lives, but I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the notifications. Yeah, January has been brutal, but I'm taking a note from you. 2024 starts now. Let's forget January. It starts now. So I'm really pleased to have Sharniya with me. So Sharniya, I'm going to see if I can get your role right. So you're Enterprise Community Strategy Director.
Yes, that's the job title. Yeah. Very long one.
With NatWest. And you've been there for 12 years. You've been there quite a while, right?
Yeah. So I started back in 2011 working in our team, and they've just really been fortunate that there've been some really interesting roles in different business areas I've been able to over that time. So but literally I think 12 years was in November, so coming up to 30 years at the end of this year.
Wow, amazing. Long time. And obviously I always have to give the disclaimer, obviously, for anybody that's watching, the views that are expressed here are Sharniya's and not necessarily those of her organisation. Always. So thank you so much, Sharniya, for joining. And obviously the way that we first met, I'm fairly sure we were connected on here before, but obviously you are one of the amazing judges for the Black Talent Awards.
Yeah.
This will be your third year as a judge as well.
Yeah. That's really exciting, actually. Yes. No, I remember when Denise reached out to me to be part of the Black Talent Awards, and just straight away, just with the objectives of what you and the team were trying to do, I thought that's actually the kind of thing I want to be involved in. So very excited for the year. I know the nominations are open, so get your nominations in. But I'm excited to sort of read what people are up to, because there are so many people out there just doing such incredible, amazing work. And they're reading them thinking, I feel like I've been put to shame. Like, I need to do more. I want to get out there and support more.
Yeah, it's very inspiring, isn't it? I think, Denise and I were talking. So for those that don't know, Denise Myers, founder of the Black Talent Awards. And one of the things that we were reflecting on is we didn't realize how inspired the judges would be as a result of being involved in the process. I think there's something quite magical about that we hadn't anticipated,
But it's so inspiring, but also really eye-opening and encouraging, because I think we've all heard the rhetoric, and I hear it less these days, I have to be honest, but we've all heard the rhetoric. Oh, we're looking for Black talent, we don't know where they are, we can't find them. There are as many people in these areas. And so to be able to see the number of nominations that come in and read what people are doing, not just in their day roles, they're breaking down barriers, they're working really hard. Outside of that, they're creating networks, they're volunteering, they're building businesses. And it's just, honestly, sometimes I have to read them and think, do these people sleep? Because they do so much. But it's just really heartening as a girl who, I say a girl, I call myself a girl even though I'm a woman, but as a girl who grew up in an area that was predominantly white, and did, upon reflection, feel often like I was the only one and there wasn't really anyone really around for me to look up to. It really speaks to my inner child to say, oh my gosh, here are all the role models that you've always wanted on these pages and at the events.
Yeah, I love that. And, and as you describe it there, and then imagine that now as the role models now of these individuals for other people, which is what it's about. And something you said there, which links in quite nicely to the topic, often, as you say, these individuals that are put forward are kind of giving back, and they're paying it forward through things like their employee networks, and sometimes beyond. Actually, when I think of one of the winners from last year, I'm going to say her name's Christina Brooks, but I might have that wrong. But I think, I may have got that wrong. But I think she set up a network outside of her organisation as well, across the industry, right? So an industry-wide kind of like employee network. So what we're going to be talking about today, because you've kind of got experience of both, like internal employee networks or employee resource groups, or ERGs as they're sometimes called, but then also equality task forces, which come under different guises as well. And so, some of the stats that we hear is something like 90% of the Fortune 500 in the US apparently have employee resource groups, definitely growing in the UK, so more companies having them. Tell us a bit about your experience of the Equality Task Force. So it was a race equality task force that you were involved in, right? And tell us your experience of that and how you feel that's different to the employee network or the employee resource group.
Yeah, so we have had so we call them employee-led networks, so ELNs, because we love abbreviation at the bank.
ELNs, okay.
We've had our multicultural network, our ELN, for, I want to say probably coming up to 2 decades, probably not quite out there yet.
Wow, for the UK, that's a long time. 20, that's a long time. Like, but some of the oldest ones in the US are like 40, 50, no, actually longer than that, 50-ish years, so 50 years plus. So 20 years in the UK, that's quite a long time, actually.
I think it's slightly under, but it probably, if I don't want to lie, but I think it's anywhere between sort of 15 to 18 years. So it has been a time. And our first ever sort of employee-led network was the Focused Women's Network. And so having the multicultural network, that's probably the second longest running one. And working that for us, I guess the employee-led networks, they're probably a bit of a combination between what you would term an employee resource group and an affinity group. So, a place for people to come together. But they were really looking at how do we create opportunities from a career perspective, but also how are we bringing our colleagues together? How are we ensuring that, cultural touch points are shared, that people have places that they can come. And then our Race Equality Task Force, that was actually set up in 2020, which probably surprisingly when you hear the year, after the murder of George Floyd, our CEO at the time met with the heads of the multicultural network, who were the heads at the time, and wanted to understand, what can we do? How should we be responding to this? Where should we be going? And they essentially came to the conclusion that we need more focus and more attention in this area, and so thus the Race Equality Task Force was born. And I guess the focus of the Race Equality Task Force and why it's slightly different to the employee-led network that we have is our employee-led network, while it is set in a space of understanding the colleague voice and what we need, and being able to then share that in different forums, and they definitely have representation. So we have something called our DE&I Action Committee, so we have representations from our employees there. They also have regular meetings with our DE&I teams, and all our I guess the diversity focus areas that we focus on have an executive sponsor, and so within that our employee-led networks also feed and have regular contact with our ethnicity exec sponsor. The Racial Equality Task Force was set up to, I think, really more focus on what should we be doing to drive organizational change. And so the Racial Equality Task Force takes that one step further, is that we have also, sorry, I should have said, I've recently been appointed as one of the new co-leads, because our original Racial Equality Task Force leads were in situ for 3 years. So we tend to have about a bit of a tenure of types of roles. So bringing fresh thinking, so that type of work can be really intensive, emotionally draining, and so we like to bring in new people to kind of have that and renewed focus, renewed vigor, but equally also means that the previous leads can take up a bit more of an advisory role, so they're not having to do the day-to-day doing, but they can still have that influence and that input. And so the task force has more of a leadership focus, so focusing on how are we really getting into the areas where we should have accountable owners. So our Racial Equality Task Force focuses on 3 areas. So we have a colleague, a customer focus, and a community focus. And again, that's where it differs slightly to the ELN, because the ELNs, they mainly focus on what is the colleague experience, how we bring
mainly internal.
Exactly. And while they do some volunteering, they don't necessarily have a strategy for how are we looking at engaging with our customers, how are we really and what we're doing for communities from backgrounds. So the task force is really more focused, has more, I think, senior engagement in terms of engaging with all of our executive committee, but the is also responsible for or participates in our ethnicity advisory council. So our advisory council was set up shortly after the task force was set up, and that's a council of external industry experts from a wide range of different industries, because for us it's not just about, you know, what's happening in the finance industry, it's what's happening all over, so that we have the expertise and, again, best practice that we can bring and look at what will work for our organisation. So the task force also sits on that ethnicity advisory council with those external and our ethnicity sponsors as well.
That's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought in the external bit, because that's definitely something I've seen. So whether something is called, you know, an equality task force or a race action plan, some people call it, or some people might have signed up to, you know, a race code or whatever it be. But actually, that aspect that you mentioned there, well, two aspects actually that I want to touch on. First of all, the external. So you're bringing in external advisors, you know, that are kind of, you know, have their fingers at the pulse, and I guess bring with them then more influence, more, you know, almost like more weight to the matter at hand, you know, more weight to what needs doing. And also, you know, you talked about the seniority internally and the importance of, like, that group being able to hold the senior leadership to account, and the whole of the senior leadership, which with your employee-led networks, obviously they often have, like, say, one exec sponsor. But effectively what this task force is doing, you know, with those external people to bolster it, is holding the whole organisation to account almost, aren't they?
Yes, and that's exactly the intention of it. So having those external voices, it helps, because I think there can be, you know, within our organisation, this is how our colleagues are feeling and this is what we're experiencing. But what the external, the advisory council are able to lend them is that this is what's happening in other organisations, and this is how they're tackling it, and this is how they're approaching these things that are coming up. But I think they also are able to bring in that credibility for our senior execs who, you know, want to hear what is happening across the board, is how are we in comparison to what everybody else is doing. There's always that sense of, you know, wanting to, how are we doing? But then as well, some of our members of our ethnicity advisory council are researchers, which I think even, you know,
amazing.
You need both. You need the, you know, the quantitative data that says we've done this survey, or we've looked at this data and we're able to present the numbers to you and what they look. But actually, then from an internal perspective, we can also share well, when you're talking about this particular area where I don't know, say the ethnicity pay gap, for instance, we can share, well, here's the colleague experiences who are in these roles, and here's why we need to have these programs to help build that pipeline to help move on more into senior roles. So I think having all of those tools to be able to really create the message and share the narrative of why this is important is really valuable.
And I love, the other thing I loved as well, when you talked about almost like what was the catalyst for it, you know, it was 2020, so it was that particular event that drove it. And I think, you know, we've seen a lot of that, and so there is this thing about, you know, something has happened that's quite you know, it's global, it's quite seismic, you know, and therefore as an organisation we need a response, which it kind of reminded me of, you know, the story of the very first employer resource group, which apparently was Xerox, was in response to the riots at the time in kind of upstate New York. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of just reminded me of that, and that at the time, their CEO Joe Wilson went and spoke to, you know, civil rights activists and all of that. So it reminded me of that when you were talking about it in terms of, you know, post George Floyd. I'm wondering whether you think that, because obviously we're talking about a race equality task force. Are you aware of any other types of identities that have got these sorts of equality task force? And I guess I'm leading a question into, do you think there are potentially other groups that could benefit from almost like this sort of bolstering of their employee networks, just because of, you know, it could be, you know, a rise in Islamophobia or, you know, other certain types of hate crimes. I just want to sort of get your thoughts on that, maybe.
Yeah, no, do you know what? It is something that has come up internally, and I do think it's an interesting question, and I think there are definitely benefits to having an additional task force that I guess sits and has, as you say, that kind of more focus on how are we really holding the organisation to account and driving the message home, particularly at a senior level, and being able to get into those rooms where maybe the networks aren't able to is really positive. One thing we do, which is great, is that actually our exec, so our CEO, is a sponsor of all of the ELNs, so they will have they do have opportunity to speak to our CEO on a regular basis. However, they don't necessarily get to sit around with the whole of the executive committee, and I think that's where the difference is. But we have a number of employee-led networks. So we have our Rainbow Network, which is our LGBTQ plus focus network. We have Enable, which is our disability focus network, as well as Diversity Alliance. We have our Gender Network, which has various strands, and we've recently, or I say recently, it's probably 2 years ago now, but everything feels recent. Have a Male Allies that's part of the Gender Network as well. So we do have those focuses, different focus areas around diversity, but the Race Task Force is currently the only task force that we have, and so I think there are definitely positives to having the task force, but I think there are some challenges that can come with that. And the challenge that we have, and I think even across the board when we think about the number of networks we have and then the number of strands we have, because even with our multicultural network, we then have faith strands, and then we have ethnicity strands, and so it can feel as though it's this almost like, you know, a huge thing that keeps sprouting arms and legs, which is great from a perspective of there are so many people who are passionate about this and want to support, but I think there needs to then be that contract of how do we all make sure we're aligning around a few messages so our leaders don't get overwhelmed, because I do think sometimes we've been in danger in the past of being like, our group wants this, our group wants this, our group wants this, our group wants this, and that can then become we can't fix all of that. So it's about if you are to have that task force, really focusing on how do you make sure that your race equality task force or your equality task force, whatever the diversity strand you're focusing on in your network, if you have affinity groups, are all looking at what are the key things that we can focus on right now, and how do we align that message so that when we go to our senior leaders for we need this, you have impact and you don't look as though you're trying to make multiple demands.
It needs to be aligned, doesn't it? It's aligning it, and whether it's a case of the task forces horizon is further out and the employee-led network is, here's our program of events for the next 12 months or whatever it be, and it's making sure that they still align, so if the focus is, I don't know, advancement or pay gap or whatever, how does that program, the shorter term program, still support that? So it doesn't, you don't want it to seem like you're just doing stuff for the sake of it, just lots of stuff. And there's a saying, one of the places I used to work, there was a saying, busy fools. We don't want to be busy fools, right? We want things to have a purpose and for it to be joined up, because then it's much stronger, especially with things like pressure on budgets. Right, a lot of employee-led networks are having pressure on budgets. So the more joined up it can be, and when your exec sponsors see that it's joined up and it's consistent, it makes more sense. And then it's the yes is easier than the no. Why are we doing this? You shouldn't have your exec saying why are we doing this. In terms of some of the areas I was thinking around in the equality task force, which you've sort of mentioned on there, but maybe around faith. So we know, for example, over the last couple of years, an increase in hate crimes related to faith, and especially with what's going on in the Middle East. And then also the other area that's kind of like sticking in my mind, although it's quite a complex area, is around gender and trans identities as well, which again is so complex. But we know again that the level of hate crimes, we've had some quite high profile, tragedies certainly here in the UK. You do wonder, do some of those areas need a task force? And I guess in terms of the way that organisations approach this, it could be maybe, okay, we have a you know, a three or a 4 or 5 year task force or whatever that runs on this diversity strand, then we have one that runs on that, and then, you know, to kind of put the resources where the need is greatest, almost, you know.
No, I think that's a really interesting idea, actually, looking at that. Make sure we're bringing all of those experiences and, as you say, having that focus in that area, because I think we have run the risk from a sort of like a global perspective of it's almost that what's in the media gets the attention, right? And you often do have that struggle of hearing groups who are then crying out thinking, well, why are they getting this attention at the moment when things or struggles happening in our community as well? But definitely an interesting idea to think about. Are there opportunities to have task forces that then are able to share the focus, but looking at it?
Absolutely.
There's opportunity as well to look at what are some of the like areas of commonality that different groups are struggling with and battling with, and actually are we looking how can we design solutions that support all of those groups, because we know that we struggle with, I don't know, let's say senior representation, so representation, senior leadership. Can we all come together to look at solutions for that, opposed to, again, it being this thing of, oh, look here, look there, look there, look there.
And I do think that there's something, and this word is coming up a lot, you know, the intersectionality, you know, as you call it, those common challenges. I think it's coming up a lot more as a topic generally, and it's definitely something I would ask the, you know, the employee-led networks to think about, because particularly if you, for example, you've got budget constraints, right? And I had a conversation with somebody yesterday, and she was talking about International Women's Day, and she was like, oh, I'm thinking that, you know, maybe we join up with our network of African heritage, and do we join up to do an event? You know, and it kind of just makes sense, especially if you've got those constraints. But you know, task forces that are looking at the intersectionality. So, and in my mind, I'm thinking of things like, you know, like, say, for example, social mobility, which really cuts through a lot of the diversity strands, because actually what you're looking at, and it actually, I don't want to say it ticks boxes, but from a legislative perspective, in terms of, you know, positive action and, you know, making sure that things are done that are fair. When we look at social mobility and deprivation, and it cuts through different identities, it's hard for anybody to argue this isn't fair. You know, that group does not deserve X, because we know that social mobility is a real challenge, and we know that still at the top of organisations, you know, those from a lower socioeconomic status are still struggling to get there. So actually, there is something about, you know, when task forces focus on that as an area, it kind of, what I'm seeing is in organisations, it tends to galvanise, because everyone can see themselves or see people that look like them benefiting from that activity. Do you know what I mean?
No, definitely. It is an area we have been focusing on more in recent years, and, you know, the agenda is still, as every agenda is, to be fair, still like progressing and still finding out data, but actually when you think about intersectionality, as you say, social mobility and socioeconomics definitely cuts across a lot of the that we talk about when we talk about, you know, from either underrepresented backgrounds. So it is, I think it is an area that over the next few years will definitely get a lot more focus. And one of the that we have done internally is within our sort of employee sentiment surveys, we have looking at that socioeconomic status aspect, and looking at what does that mean of outcomes for us. And so being able to bring that into the conversations we're having has really helped. As you say, some of those struggles that we had before, where people didn't necessarily engage because they weren't from that background, you hear a lot more that people are like, oh, well, that makes sense to me, because I came from a similar background. And why we need to do this. So it definitely is an interesting opportunity to be able to take advantage of.
Definitely, it's definitely on the radar a lot more. Sometime last year, I was invited to kind of apply for a non-exec role, and one of the questions I was asked was, you know, did your parents go to university? Did your grandparents go to university? And I thought, oh, this is about social mobility, which I thought, you know, it's important if people are happy to you know, give that information. So just in the last few minutes, then let's talk about how organizations can go about establishing one of these, depending on, I guess, where their employee led network is and what they feel the need is. But how, if you think back to like sort of say 2020, how can organizations go about establishing these, especially if they're going to get, for example, external support in, which is great, right? Because we don't want it just all left on the internal resources as per usual.
Exactly. I think that first of all, organisations need to again look at the data. Where are the greatest needs, and again, are there of commonality? And I think to your point, looking at, are there opportunities to set up a task force that is focused on more than one area, so that we can come to create solutions for all. So one of the things that I guess was really helpful for our task force being set up was straight away it was the CEO who was engaged and advocated for this. So I think from an organisational perspective, depending on who it is that's thinking about doing this, you need to make sure you have that senior buy-in and senior engagement, and really bringing them into what is the purpose of this and what are we hoping to achieve. And I think having clear goals with clear measurements and also deadlines, because I think sometimes we go into these things of, we want to change the world, and then it's like, yes, but how? So it's almost working your way backwards from we want to change the world to what is actually going to change the world. And one thing our task force did when they set up that was really great was they utilised like different sources of data. So they did an internal survey of all of our colleagues, those who wanted to participate. But it was the first survey we'd ever done that was specifically focused on sort of race and ethnicity. Obviously, if you're looking at broader than that, but what I would say is having a survey that's focused specifically on these areas to understand, get people's understanding of what they think of diversity and inclusion. And we do have now an annual survey around diversity, inclusion and belonging since then, which is really positive. But then also being able to bring in external perspective. So we also with an external organisation that helped us to really like drill down into what were our colleagues really feeling, what was the truth, because oftentimes people will fill in a survey but they might think, oh, I'm going to be penalised for this, and as to all intents and best intentions of that's not the case. Colleagues have that. So if you're able to bring in an external organisation that can almost be, they know that it's being run by them and not by the organisation, and it's not the responses are aggregated, that really helps. Being able to utilise the data that we capture via sort of onboarding via our HR platform was another area. But I think as well, it's looking for, as you said, those external experts that are doing great work in the DE&I space, and again, meet those people through networking, but also looking at who are the key people that are speaking on platforms like LinkedIn, are doing what you do, because those are the people that are going to be able, and making sure as well that you're working. Don't just look at who's in your industry, look at people who are working across different industries, because some industries are doing really great stuff and other industries are still, on that journey. So how can you bring in, look at your comparators, but also look at what are other people doing and how can we make that fit for purpose for organisation. And then once they'd done all of that, they took all of that data and they distilled it into commitments. Some organisations would call it a race action plan, but it was essentially distilled into 10 commitments that we were then able to year on year look at what have we done in this area here, and provide those sort of annual updates. And that's another way for us to hold ourselves to account. So again, if you're looking to do this, that making sure you have points where, whether it's your advisory council, your board, or your employees, who's holding you to account, and then how are you making sure that you are doing activity and shifting the dial based on your plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And and you mentioned the data, which I would almost say, obviously you can potentially set up a task force and then task the task force with getting the data, but there's something about you don't want all of the actions and the commitments until you've seen the data, until you understand what the problem is, and then you've decided what you want to do. Don't get the task force sort of too far down the road until you've got that clarity, definitely. And then something else you said there about the CEO being behind it is so important, because if you're going to be tying up internal resource and then also potentially getting on board external resource and spending money on surveys and all of that, you absolutely need the person right at the top to be on board. And I know sometimes with the employee-led networks, especially sometimes, there's a change in leadership and maybe the person that was a big fan has now moved on, and what do you do and all of that stuff. So I always say, when you're struggling with buy-in, you want to start with what's the thing that you can get the CEO on board with, and I sort of hate to say it, but we're going through a bit of an anti-DEI wave now, right? But the reality is inclusion and belonging is not going anywhere, right? People know it's good for business. But even if you can get your leadership on board with something like, for example, a social mobility or an angle where the CEO is more comfortable that it's the most inclusive it can be, if that makes sense, start there, because actually, even by looking at that social mobility strand, you will still hit a lot of the diversity strands anyway. You just will. Once you start to delve into the data, you will see that it's, individuals, it might be women in a certain area from a Bangladeshi background, or it might be, when you really cut into the data, it will tell you what the need really is, and you can't argue with the data, right? So sometimes you have to start with the area that it's easiest to get people on board with, definitely. Yeah, so we're nearly finished, really. So what would your final tips be to anybody that's listening, maybe also in the employee-led networks, in terms of how they can work with and support the task forces as well?
I think my tips or things to think about would be, all of this work, I think, is around building relationships. And I think sometimes people forget that actually, if you're able to build relationships with the right people, that can help you have greater influence. And ultimately, what we are trying to do is influence change. So I think identifying who your key stakeholders are and starting to focus on building those relationships is really important. I also read something recently that a colleague sent me, which was it was a study that, I think it was TFL, I don't want to lie, but I think it was TFL around effective messaging. And actually they did a survey where they asked employees, I'm simplifying it, so forgive me, but ultimately, why is D&I important to you? Is it because it's got a business case, or is it because it's just the right thing to do? And when they asked that verbally, most people answered, it's the right thing to do. Absolutely, of course, that's why we're behind it. But then when they actually did a survey that was, anonymous and wasn't face to face, people's answers didn't actually align to that. And so when they were asked to respond to certain things and then give a reason why they responded in that way, it looked for diverse communities. Oftentimes the messaging around it's absolutely the right thing to do was the one that was the most effective, influential. But when it was for other people, sometimes actually no messaging at all in terms of this is the reason why helped. But in other times it was more around the kind of like the business parameters around it were what helped to convince people to do these things. So not to say that we go out and change all of our messaging, but I think it's also about, think about who your audience is and looking at tailoring your message to what they will, I guess, ultimately influence them and what their purpose is. So I think that's something that you said earlier. And again, I think I said it earlier, but I just think it's so important to reiterate, from a ERG perspective or in a task force perspective, just make sure that you are communicating with each other and you are, where possible, aligning as much as you can, and you're working with people, not against them. Because a colleague of mine says this all the time, but this, there's my camera, this has way more power than this.
It's so true. That the working together is so important, just generally in terms of the employee-led networks. I think there is something about, employee-led networks, when it goes rogue and everyone's just out for themselves and trying, a bit like crabs in a barrel, right? That's that famous sort of saying. And you don't want that, because actually that's the land of divide and rule, right? And divide and conquer. And actually we are stronger together. So recognizing where the overlaps are, where the common challenges are, the common interventions, initiatives, where you can pull budget. I'm hoping that, come 2024 and certainly in the future years, that we're going to see more of that, people coming together. And certainly, the task force, the task forces it's a really good place to start, definitely. And I love the fact that it's bolstering also the ERGs, who, it can be very tiring work. So definitely something to think about if you've not got one of those. Sharniya, thank you so much for your time on a Friday lunchtime.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's great to have conversations like this.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. If anybody wants to get hold of Sharniya, because we didn't talk that much about what you do in terms of your day job, but obviously Sharniya has very much an external facing day job as well, in terms of, working with members of the community and like looking at, access to finance and how communities are served. So, some great work that you're doing. So please do connect with Sharniya here on LinkedIn if you want to find out more. But thank you, Sharniya.
Thanks.
Hope you have an amazing weekend. Thank you if you're listening live or if you're listening on the replay. And yeah, that's it. We are out of here. Thanks, guys. Bye.